May 8th, 1945, V-Day. Bells shook steeples from Ohio cornfields to Boston's brick lanes. At Camp Halford, a small prisoner compound outside Plymouth, Massachusetts, the news rolled across the gravel yard like a warm wind. The gate guards grinned, the mess crew banged pots, and then the loudspeaker, from an office that still smelled of new paint, announced the obvious. The war in Europe was over. For the 58 German women housed there, former auxiliary clerks, radio operators, orderlies, victory meant papers, transport, and a path home through a shattered continent. But the announcement, delivered by Captain Eleanor Price, did not produce the chorus she expected. A long, uneven silence spread among the women, and more than one pair of eyes dropped to the floorboards as if home were something to be stepped around, not toward. 6 months earlier, in November 1944, the first group had arrived, captured on roads through Belgium and the north of France. They stepped off the trucks stiff-backed and wary, uniforms patched and thinned, hair tucked tight, as if regulation itself could be a shield. Among them was Liesl Brenner, 23, a communications specialist from Bremen, with a leather notebook she guarded like a passport to a life that had slipped out to sea. She spoke careful English learned in school, enough to ask for soap and silence. That first night the barracks creaked with whispered German and clean American sheets. No one slept deeply. Everyone listened for what would happen next. Camp Halford was an odd, in-between place. 2 barracks, a wire fence more psychological than high, and a whitewashed infirmary that always smelled faintly of camphor and coffee. It had been set up fast, with borrowed cots and a command staff that learned as it went. Captain Price, one of the few women in authority in the region, had watched the transport roll in from a porch that still had sawdust in its cracks. "We'll keep things orderly," she told her sergeants, meaning also humane. Order would be tested immediately by winter. The women moved like a flock, silent at first, clipped in their routines. They saluted habit, even when no officer expected it. At mess, they ate with the measured efficiency of people who had learned not to ask for seconds. Private Tom Whitaker, Iowa farm boy turned guard, noticed a slight brunette, Marta Vogel, turning away to cough into her sleeve. The infirmary had blankets, but not motherly hands. Tom brought both in the form of a steaming mug of mint tea, mixed the way his grandmother swore, chased the lungs back into shape. Marta accepted it with startled politeness. Then with gratitude she struggled to name. The next evening, he left another cup by the door without a word. Sergeant Ben Okada, whose parents ran a small produce shop in California before the war uprooted everything, understood the ache of being looked at like a headline. He started chalkboard English with simple exchanges. "Hello. Thank you, my name is..." Trading German words in return. Liesl drifted to the board. Language, she'd learned, could be a bridge sturdy enough to hold strangers. December brought a decision about Christmas. Captain Price asked the chaplain how to honor something tender without losing discipline. The answer arrived from the women themselves. Liesl approached the office with posture she had polished into armor. "Captain," she said, "may we make decorations? Paper only. And perhaps sing?" That night the mess hall was trimmed with stars cut from ration cartons and thread pulled from tired socks. The women lined up by habit more than instruction. They began with "O Tannenbaum," voices stacking like beams. Then they reached for "Silent Night," in English, imperfect, earnest, oddly steady. Tom Whitaker wrote home that he forgot, for the span of a carol, that anyone in the room had worn the wrong uniform. The singing didn't erase the war. It sanded a few edges off the present tense of it. Afterward, conversation loosened. A kitchen crew laughing over burned sugar became a shared joke. Marta started helping in the infirmary, where Dr. Robert Hale pretended to be gruff and failed. Liesl translated at sick call, then in the quartermaster's office, then for everything. Her notebook changed. It held fewer addresses to memorize and more words to choose between. The fence stayed where it was, but the space inside felt less like a box and more like a courtyard where people could pass without bracing. February carried bad weather and worse news. Newspapers laid out on the rec table showed photographs no one could misunderstand, even grainy. Names, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, entered the room like smoke. The women gathered around the pages with faces that couldn't decide how to hold what they saw. Some had believed the Reich was stern but clean, hard but fair. Now their hands trembled on the newsprint. Marta whispered to Liesel in German, "Is this true? Have we been blind?" No one in the building spoke easily for hours. Captain Price stood apart, letting grief and confusion run their course. She had seen the same stunned collapse in men's camps, but here the sound was a long, low keening that wasn't just for victims on the page. It was for illusions that were dying right there in Massachusetts. That night Liesel wrote, "What is the use of a uniform if it keeps you from seeing? If home is not what we thought, where do we go?" In the mornings afterward, work continued. Laundry, kitchen, repairs, but with a new gravity. Sergeant Okada's language lessons took on quieter purpose. Learn the words to say I'm sorry. Learn the words to ask what now. The women began to volunteer beyond their assigned hours, as if motion could measure remorse. Dr. Hale admitted he relied on Marta's calm more than on any bottle. The mess hall felt like a place rebuilding itself one small courtesy at a time. By April, Camp Halford functioned like a village. Garden rows sprouted behind the barracks under the supervision of a woman named Greta Hart, who could coax food from gravel. The record room ran like a pocket watch because Clara Doring reorganized everything as if she meant to pass an inspection from heaven. Captain Price registered the shift with a professional skepticism she did not quite believe. Then orders began to circulate about repatriation. Men's camps were moving prisoners by the trainload. For the women, the path was muddier. Jurisdictional lines blurred when policy met an exception no one had planned for. Liesel gathered letters with the help of the Red Cross, sending queries into the ruins of Bremen, Hanover, the Ruhr. Replies were few. One woman learned her parents were dead. Another got a postcard that might as well have been ash. Tom Whitaker, reading these bits of paper with his hat pushed back, said nothing that would make it worse. He fixed handrails and brought extra sugar packets like they were talismans against the future. When May arrived, with its bells and parades and the official word about ships, Captain Price called everyone to the hall. She explained the schedule: medical checks, rail to Boston, pier, then Europe. She expected cautious relief. She got motion. Liesel stood. Marta stood. 12 more women gathered behind them. Not defiant, not meek, resolved. "Captain," Liesel said, "some of us asked to remain. Temporarily, if possible." The room was suddenly all breath and no air. The request ricocheted off policy like a pebble off steel. Prisoners do not refuse freedom. Farms do not ask for rain in a flood. Captain Price asked why, formally. The answers were a braided cord. Family lost or untraceable. Cities burned down to their cobbles. Shame. And something else, harder to say. In this strange American camp, they had learned dignity given freely and work that mattered more than obedience. "We would like to keep becoming the people we started to be here," Marta said, hands knotted but voice steady. The legal problem was immediate. The Geneva Convention spoke of repatriation, not rerouting. Captain Price sent wires to Boston and Washington that read like questions in uniform. Outside the office, the camp held its breath. The women who had stepped forward kept working, as if usefulness itself were petition and proof. Liesel translated paperwork with the speed of someone who knew there might be a test at the end. Marta filled the infirmary with presents, thermometers, yes, but also a hand on a forehead that made pain behave. Greta fixed the stove. No one could bully into lighting. Meanwhile, the local paper picked up a hushed version of the story. Letters came, some accusing, some soft with church words about redemption. Mrs. Ruth Harrow, a schoolteacher from town who had been bringing books to the camp, appeared at the gate with an offer. If allowed, she and her husband would sponsor one of the women. She said it like a volunteer in a dare. Waiting stretched. A visiting pastor, Lucas Bauer, German-born, American for decades, spoke to the group in their language for the first time in months. He didn't soothe. He asked, "If a house is burning and you have 2 buckets, where do you throw the water? On the blaze in your neighbor's yard, or on your own roof?" Some women saw in his question a duty to return. Others heard a challenge to carry what they had learned into the new country that had shown it to them. When the wire from Washington finally arrived, its language was careful, almost shy about the precedent it was setting. Those who wished to return would be repatriated at once. Those who did not could be reclassified as displaced persons, no longer prisoners, not yet citizens, and apply for sponsorship, housing, and work. The fence would not be their home. The world would have to be. The decision split the 12. 5 chose Germany for mother tongues and graves that still needed visiting. 7 chose America for the work that had become a kind of daily prayer. Liesel was among the 7. Marta, too, though the choice cost her a night of tears for a brother she might never find. The camp moved like a theater switching sets. Papers were signed. Trunks were packed. Captain Price, who had been taught to keep her face iron flat, found herself clearing her throat too often. Repatriation Day, June 20th, looked like a town farewell more than a military evolution. The bus idled. The women who were leaving stood with posture softened by months of ordinary kindness. They carried photographs taken on cheap cameras and a few small gifts, a hand-stitched handkerchief, a book with the spine repaired, a recipe folded into a letter. "You came here as enemies," Captain Price said, voice steady until it wasn't. "And you leave as something harder to name and easier to hold. Neighbors, perhaps." Liesel answered for the women who would remain. "We thought we understood what America was," she said. "We did not. We hoped to earn our place in the truth we learned here." The bus pulled away. Tears stood without shame on both sides of the wire. The 7 who stayed did not go back to their cots. They reported to new lives. The Harrows took Liesel in and introduced her to a desk at the town clerk's office where a translation made petitions move instead of stall. Dr. Hale arranged for Marta to train at Worcester General as a nursing assistant. Her competence erased skepticism by the second week and won her a scholarship by winter. Greta joined a mechanic's shop and made wrenches sing. The town adjusted. Some said too fast. Some said not fast enough. Most watched, then nodded. Years thinned the war's smoke, but didn't blow it away. Liesel became, improbably, a civil servant in a language she once conjugated with a pencil clenched in schoolgirl fingers. She married, quietly, a journalist named David Sutter, who believed paperwork could be a moral instrument. They raised children who understood that 2 languages in a kitchen is not confusion but abundance. Marta did not marry. She built a ward where fear slowed down and listened to her voice. On Sundays, she spoke to church groups about remorse that turns outward into service. Across the ocean, the 5 who had returned wrote letters describing streets slowly cleared of rubble and neighbors learning how to be neighbors again. They started German-American friendship circles not because diplomacy demanded it, but because their own lives insisted it could be done. Captain Eleanor Price retired to a house with a porch that faced east. When people asked what stories she carried from the war, she talked about a little camp and a group of women who complicated the word enemy until it broke open and let the light through. A quarter century after V-Day, Liesel Brenner Sutter stood at a United Nations lectern with her old leather notebook in her handbag, the paper inside brittle as memory. She spoke calmly about choices made in a small Massachusetts camp when the world was reorganizing itself at gunpoint and then with open hands. "Home," she said, "is not the place that claims you loudest. It is the place where you are most responsible." She did not romanticize. She talked about the morning the photographs arrived on the rec table, the bruise they left, the way work and kindness became a way to live with knowledge that could not be unknowable. Reporters later called the speech moving. Liesel shrugged. She had learned to prefer verbs over adjectives. The next year, Marta returned to Germany as part of the medical exchange. She walked streets rebuilt on old foundations and felt kinship with a country that had learned, as she had, to rebuild character the way one mends a bone, with time, alignment, and pain honestly named. She came back to Worcester to run a ward, to teach, to insist that every chart had a person in it, not just a case. The story of Camp Halford did not end in a file box. It grew into policy slowly, like ivy along a courthouse wall. Practical changes in how displaced people were processed, a willingness to see skill and repentance as assets rather than liabilities. More privately, it changed the town's habits. The Harrows children kept a guest room that was always half prepared, as if life might knock with needs worth making space for. Tom Whitaker went home to Iowa, married his sweetheart, and told his kids that strength looks like many things, including the act of setting down a rifle to pass someone a cup. Sergeant Okada helped his parents reopen their shop. He said very little about the insult of barbed wire. He displayed mercy like produce, fresh each morning. Every Christmas, a card arrived at Captain Price's address with cramped handwriting from somewhere in Germany or New England, just a signature and a line from Silent Night, written in the language of the sender's day. She kept them all in a cigar box beside her worn passbook and a small brass nameplate that once sat on an office door at a camp that no longer existed. People who study war like to chart divisions, fronts, factions, flags. The Halford story charts a seam that healed. 7 women stayed and became citizens who paid taxes and volunteered at libraries and argued politely at school board meetings. 5 returned and became witnesses to a version of America that the newspapers did not always report. The one that can hold enemies without hating them and that asks hard questions of itself when evidence demands it. None escaped the past. All learned to live forward from it. When Liesel's oldest daughter once asked why her mother kept that battered notebook, Liesel held it up like a tiny, stubborn door. Because once upon a time, she said, "Word were the only place I knew how to build a home." The girl grew up to teach history and, every December, to tell her students about a mess hall where 2 languages braided into one song. If they asked for a moral, she offered none. She gave them a map. Kindness, work, responsibility, truth. Then she wrote 4 more words on the board. Choose, repair, stay, begin, and told them that sometimes the bravest thing any person can do is exactly what a handful of former enemies did in Massachusetts in 1945, decide to become neighbors. Letters continued to cross the Atlantic like diligent birds. From Hanover, Ruth Schaefer wrote that her street smelled of lime dust and wet brick and that neighbors argued about whether to plant potatoes in the park. From Bremen, a note arrived bearing a new official stamp and a smudge of coal. We are building our roof by hand. Each tile is a promise. Liesel answered every letter with the ceremony of a clerk and the heart of a sister. She enclosed photographs of Massachusetts autumns so loudly colored they looked like a prank, and a clipping about a citizenship class she had volunteered to teach on Thursday nights. 10 people in a library basement, dictionaries open, nerves masked by concentration. Marta wrote, too, but hers were fewer, heavier. She told of night shifts and the small miracle of a fever breaking at 4 a.m., of learning when to speak and when to listen, of the first time a patient squeezed her fingers at discharge and said, "You kept looking at me like I was someone worth staying alive for." She pinned that sentence in her locker like a medal. The town learned their names slowly, as good towns do. Liesel at the clerk's desk, Marta at the hospital, Greta in blue coveralls under a Studebaker that left the shop purring like a cat that had forgiven its owner. Not everyone applauded. A letter to the editor railed that former enemies were taking jobs from local boys, though the author misspelled 3 words and the editor left the mistakes as printed, a quiet editorial of his own. At the grocery, a veteran with a cane studied Marta's badge and decided aloud that he wasn't ready yet. Marta nodded, thanked him for telling her the truth, and moved to the next patient with the same care, because care that waits for unanimous welcome is not care. Captain Price, now retired but still summoned to civic meetings like an oracle no one wanted to name as such, spoke once to a room that had grown prickly at the topic of newcomers. "Discipline taught me to look for results," she said. "Our results are neighbors who shovel each other's steps and children who speak 2 languages while choosing kindness in both." It didn't end the argument. It bent it toward usefulness. That winter, a fire jumped a row house on Cedar Lane. The first 2 people through the smoke were a young volunteer firefighter who had played stickball with Tom Whitaker's nephews and Greta Hart, who'd grab a blanket and a crowbar with the casual speed of someone who didn't ask permission to do what was needed. The newspaper ran no editorial. It ran a photograph of soot-streaked faces and a caption that said, "Simply saved." In 1950, paperwork met hope in a courtroom that smelled of varnish and long stories. Liesl stood with the Harrows at her side, right hand raised, answering questions in English that no longer felt borrowed. When the judge pronounced the solemn words, her new name wore no disguise, Citizen. Outside, she pressed both palms to the courthouse railing and laughed the quiet laugh of someone who has just put down a weight she didn't know she'd been carrying every day. Marta's path was longer, tangled in licensure and letters that had to cross oceans and return stamped again. She kept a calendar pinned by the infirmary clock and crossed out days with an X that looked more like stitches than cancellations. When the final letter arrived, approval, exam date set, Dr. Hale shook her hand with a formality that cracked into a grin. She passed the exam as if every hour spent holding a pulse had been a page she could study. The hospital changed her badge from assistant to registered nurse. She tucked the old badge in a book the way some people press a leaf. She wanted to remember what she had been, not only what she had become. One afternoon, the past walked through the clerk's office door, wearing a coat gone shiny at the elbows. He was 30 and looked older. He held his hat like he wasn't sure the room would let him keep it. "I'm looking for Liesl Brenner," he said, in German, so careful it sounded like stage work. Liesl stood before she knew she'd moved. "Friedrich." He nodded, and then both of them forgot the rules of offices. They were brother and sister in a doorway, touching each other's faces as if to confirm a rumor that had finally turned into flesh. He had survived conscription, chaos, the long walk home. He had not survived hope cleanly. Loss had chewed the edges of who he used to be. They sat on a bench and let sentences trip over one another. He told her of neighbors who had shared bread and of a winter so hard they named it like a person. She told him of a town that had measured her by her work and then, slowly, by her jokes. That evening, the Harrows set an extra plate. Friedrich ate as if he had signed a treaty with hunger and was now trying to be polite about it ending. Later, alone with Liesl, he said the line she would carry for years: "You did not abandon home. You built one strong enough to pull me across the water." The fence at Camp Halford was taken down in 1952. The land returned to scrub and birds. Captain Price received a small crate from the quartermaster. Ledgers, a crooked sign that had once said infirmary with its letters stubbornly peeling, a brass key whose door no longer existed. She kept the sign. "The world," she said, "could always use more rooms where people get better." The former prisoners and the former guards gathered one autumn at the old site with thermoses and folding chairs. Tom Whitaker drove out from Iowa with his eldest boy, who asked whether this was a battlefield. "No," Tom said, "this was a seam." They sang Silent Night, badly, on purpose, in both languages. Someone not very musical tried America the Beautiful, and someone else, even less musical, came in with None Dank It All I Got, and the mess of it felt exactly right. They told new stories that were really the same story. A moment when someone chose neighbor over label and the ground quietly shifted. Before they left, Marta spoke a blessing none of them would have called a prayer. "May the next people who use this ground learn faster than we did." History moved on because that is its worst and best habit. Liesl's children grew into the sort of adults who could fix a leaky sink in a tense meeting with equal competence. One became a teacher who kept chalk dust on her sleeves. One became a translator and claimed it was just a way of giving strangers a bridge. Marta retired from the hospital with a ceremony that she cut 2 speeches short, then volunteered 2 mornings a week because she didn't like how silence sounded at 9 a.m. on Tuesdays. On the day the town dedicated a small plaque near where Camp Halford had stood, bronze warmed by October's sun, names not listed, stories summarized with the restraint of good metalwork. Captain Price, now white-haired and fox-sharp, read the inscription with a nod. "We were better here than we had to be," she said. "That matters." People clapped. Someone brought ginger cookies. Afterward, Liesl stood a long time by the plaque, touching its edge the way she used to touch the edges of her notebook. She thought of all the doors the war had slammed and of the few that had opened anyway, because hands on both sides had chosen to turn the knob. She did not call it forgiveness. She called it work. And then, as she always did, she went back to her desk and began again. By the early 1960s, the women of Camp Halford had woven themselves so fully into American life that newcomers to Plymouth hardly believed there had once been a prison compound on its edge. Liesl worked in the town clerk's office with a reputation for precision softened by humor. If she stamped it, people joked, "It will not come undone." Marta had become head nurse of the pediatric ward, her steady hands remembered by children who decades later would bring their own babies back to her for checkups. Greta's garage was the sort of place where a broken tractor and a rattling school bus could arrive the same morning and both leave in better health than their owners expected. Every year, they still gathered on June 20th, the date of that unusual repatriation, to eat together, read aloud letters from across the ocean, and light a single candle for those who had returned to Germany. It was not a ceremony meant for outsiders, but occasionally a neighbor was invited in. They would sit quietly, struck by the gentle gravity of women who had crossed a chasm of history and built a bridge out of daily work. In 1965, Marta finally returned to Germany on a professional exchange program. She walked streets, paved new, past glass-front shops, and rebuilt schools. Yet underneath the shine, she felt the layers of memory, heavy as stone. In Hanover, she visited Ruth Schaefer, who had chosen repatriation 20 years earlier. Ruth greeted her with arms that had lost none of their strength. Over coffee, Ruth spoke of ration years and the silence of neighbors, of a country struggling to teach its children truth instead of myths. "We rebuild brick by brick," she said, "but the harder rebuilding is inside us." Marta listened, offering not advice, but the testimony of her own life in Massachusetts, where mistakes had been faced and mercy had been real. When she returned to America, she carried with her a certainty that both choices, staying and returning, had been brave and both had mattered. She told her colleagues at Worcester General, "Forgiveness is not a one-time thing. It is daily work like cleaning wounds." They nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight behind her words. As years moved forward, the story of Camp Halford reached classrooms and pulpits. Teachers told it as proof that history was not just about battles and treaties, but about the human choices that ripple far beyond barbed wire. Clergy used it as a parable, that kindness in captivity can reshape destinies. When the town decided to erect a small memorial near the old grounds, the women were consulted. They asked for no names, no ranks, just a simple plaque that read, "Here strangers became neighbors." 1944 to 1945. The unveiling was quiet. Liesl touched the plaque's edge. Marta stood a step behind her, and Captain Price, now frail but sharp-eyed, said softly, "It was never about keeping them in. It was about letting something better out." The words lingered in the air longer than the applause. Children on bicycles raced past, hardly noticing, and that too felt right. The memorial was not for spectacle. It was a reminder tucked into the soil, like seeds waiting for whoever needed them next. By the 1970s, new wars had filled the headlines, new enemies named, new prisoners held in camps far away. But in Plymouth, people remembered Camp Halford when they read those headlines. Letters to editors recalled the women who chose to stay, urging that compassion be shown to today's captives. Policymakers, too, took note. Scholars at universities published case studies, citing Halford as evidence that humane treatment produced not only peaceable prisoners, but future allies. For the women themselves, life was less about symbolism and more about groceries, mortgages, and grandchildren. Yet when journalists occasionally knocked on their doors, asking for quotes, Liesl would simply hold up her battered notebook and say, "The only story worth telling is that people can change if you give them space." Marta, for her part, declined most interviews, but once agreed to speak to a nursing class. Her closing line was remembered by every student in the room. "Healing begins when you stop asking what someone deserves and start asking what they need." In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, an unusual reunion was organized in Bremen. Women who had returned after captivity, women who had stayed in America, and a handful of their children gathered in a hall that still bore scars of the old bombings. They exchanged photographs, stories, and laughter edged with tears. Some spoke German, some English, most both. They compared lives lived under different flags, but joined by the same turning point in 1945. "We were all prisoners once," Ruth said, "but we learned that freedom is not just release. It is responsibility." The next day, a German newspaper ran a photograph of the reunion with the headline, "From captives to citizens, from enemies to friends." The women folded copies of the paper into their suitcases, souvenirs of a history they had lived but never sought to own. On the flight home, Liesel wrote in her notebook, "We are not footnotes. We are proof." Toward the end of their lives, the women of Halford spoke less about the war and more about gardens, grandchildren, and aches in their knees. Yet the camp never left them. On anniversaries, they would phone each other and recall the song sung that first Christmas, the newspapers spread across a table that changed everything, the bus that drove away with half their number. Captain Price passed first, buried with military honors and a folded flag. At her funeral, Liesel and Marta sat in the front pew, hands clasped. When asked to speak, Liesel said, "She taught us discipline. She also taught us mercy. One without the other is brittle. Both together make something strong enough to last." The congregation murmured assent. Outside, the air smelled of pine and memory. Marta whispered, "We are still her soldiers in a way." Liesel smiled, not with sadness, but with gratitude. The final chapter came quietly. Liesel passed in 1991. Her notebook willed to her daughter with a simple instruction: keep asking questions. Marta lived another decade, beloved in her hospital and her town. At her funeral in 2002, the plaque from Camp Halford was mentioned, the story retold. A young boy in the audience whispered to his mother, "They were prisoners?" She nodded. He frowned, then said, "But they sound like heroes." Perhaps that was the truest summary. Not heroes because they fought, but because when the chance came, they chose to change. And in that choice, they altered not only their own lives, but the course of reconciliation between nations. The legacy of Camp Halford is not in textbooks alone. It is in every neighborly act that defies history's weight. It is in every hand offered across a line once drawn in anger. And it endures wherever enemies are given the chance and the dignity to become something more. By the time the new millennium dawned, the story of Camp Halford had drifted from living memory into history books, but not entirely. A handful of university theses cited it as a unique case of female prisoners integrating into American society. Local historians organized talks at the library, where people nodded in surprise to learn that their own town had once housed German auxiliaries. The plaque at the old site became a small pilgrimage spot for curious travelers, history students, and even tourists tracing family roots. Some left flowers. Others simply stood quietly, reading the inscription twice. The women themselves, now dwindling in number, were spoken of with the kind of reverence that is less about heroism and more about gratitude, that someone had carried decency through a brutal era. Marta's funeral in 2002 felt like the closing of a chapter, but her legacy lived on in hundreds of nurses who had trained under her. When Worcester General opened a new pediatric wing, they named one hallway the Vogel Corridor in her honor. Children ran laughing under her name every day, which felt like the truest tribute. Germany, too, remembered. A historian in Bremen published a book in 2005 about women of the Wehrmacht's auxiliary units. One chapter detailed the Halford prisoners, reconstructing their lives from letters, Red Cross files, and interviews with their descendants. Copies circulated among academic circles, but also among families who had wondered for decades where their daughters, sisters, or mothers had ended up. Some families finally learned they had not perished in Allied custody, but had instead built new lives across the ocean. The news was bittersweet. One elderly brother wrote to the publisher, "I grieved her for 60 years. Now I know she lived and lived well. That is enough." In Massachusetts, Liesel's daughter received a copy of the book in the mail, marked with a ribbon on her mother's chapter. She read it by lamplight, stunned to see her mother's youthful face on a yellowing photo she had never seen before, stern, cautious, just before everything changed. That same year, the town council of Plymouth debated whether to expand the Halford plaque into a full memorial garden. Arguments echoed those of 1945, some worried about honoring the enemy, while others argued that the true enemy had been hatred itself. Eventually, compromise won. A small grove of birches was planted, a bench placed, and a bronze plaque added that bore not names but a single phrase, "Neighbors made here." On the opening day, a crowd gathered that included veterans, immigrants, school children, and even a few visiting Germans. A local choir sang Silent Night, in both languages, shaky but heartfelt. The birch leaves stirred in the summer wind, as if applauding. For many in the town, it became not only a memorial to one episode of the war, but a living reminder that reconciliation is not an abstract word. It is a daily decision. As the decades moved, descendants of the Halford women began meeting every 5 years. Some were American-born, some German, a few both. They carried photographs, stories, and recipes, laughing at how many dishes were hybrids: sauerkraut beside cornbread, apple strudel baked with American flour. These gatherings were less about the war and more about family, but the backdrop of history was never far away. At one reunion, a young man studying international law asked his grandmother, one of the returnees to Germany, what she had learned from Halford. She replied, "That justice is needed, but justice without mercy leaves no room for tomorrow." The boy carried that line into his own career, eventually working for the European Court of Human Rights. The echo of Camp Halford reached far beyond its fences, into places its founders could never have imagined. In 2010, a documentary crew arrived in Plymouth, determined to film the last living connections to Camp Halford. They interviewed townspeople, dug through local archives, and found Marta's former colleagues who still remembered her steady presence in the hospital. They filmed at the Memorial Grove, capturing sunlight spilling through birches, and interviewed Liesel's daughter as she read from her mother's notebook. The documentary aired on public television under the title Silent Night in Captivity. It sparked letters from across the world. Viewers wrote in disbelief that prisoners once begged to remain in the land of their captors, and in admiration that mercy had been powerful enough to inspire it. For a new generation, the story was no longer a footnote. It became a parable about choices in the darkest times. By then, the original Halford women were gone, but their influence remained woven into families and institutions. In Germany, Ruth's grandchildren ran a foundation supporting exchange programs for German and American students. In Massachusetts, Marta's former hospital launched a scholarship for nurses called the Healing Hands Award. Liesel's descendants kept her notebook in a glass case at the town library, alongside a translation she herself had written on its final page. "Home is where you are responsible to be kind." Visitors, including school groups, would press their faces to the glass as if they could see the ink still drying. Teachers used it as a lesson that history isn't just battles. It's also the quieter courage of people who decide not to hate. When the 75th anniversary of the end of the war approached in 2020, a joint German-American commemoration was planned. A digital event connected classrooms in Bremen and Massachusetts. Students from both sides read aloud letters written by the Halford women, translated into both languages. Some stumbled over pronunciation, others blushed, but the message carried. Fear can become trust, enemies can become neighbors. A Bremen student said afterward, "I thought history was just about winners and losers. Now I see it is also about choosing what to do after you survive." Teachers exchanged nods across the ocean, grateful that the story had survived long enough to matter still. The grove of birches at Plymouth had grown tall by then, their trunks pale as pages, their leaves whispering in every breeze. Locals called it simply the Halford trees. Couples met there to talk. Veterans came to sit. Immigrants left small tokens at the bench, scarves, folded papers, pressed flowers, as if the ground itself promised understanding. Each year on Christmas Eve, a few townspeople would gather at dusk to sing Silent Night. They never announced it publicly. It was just something that happened. One year, a passing traveler joined in, recording the song on her phone. She posted it online with the caption, "Strangers became neighbors here." The clip went viral, drawing millions of views and comments from people across the world who saw, in that small gathering, proof that the legacy of kindness endures. By the 2030s, only great-grandchildren remained, carrying stories told at kitchen tables. Some pursued careers in diplomacy, law, or medicine, citing the Halford women as inspiration. Others simply lived ordinary lives with a heightened sense that being kind to a stranger might ripple further than one could ever know. Historians continued to cite the Halford case as an early model for post-war reconciliation. Students wrote essays on it, sometimes incredulous, always moved. The story outlived its participants, as all true stories do. Not because it was grand, but because it was human. The diary, the tea, the blanket, the song. These details clung harder to memory than tanks or treaties. It had become less a record of the past and more a guidepost for the future. And so the tale of Camp Halford came to rest not in silence, but in echo. The women who once stood behind barbed wire had shown that captivity can hold seeds of transformation if watered by dignity and mercy. They had crossed from enemy to neighbor, from prisoner to citizen, from shame to service. Their descendants, their communities, and even strangers on other continents carried forward the lesson that history's darkest hours do not have the final word. That word belongs instead to the choices people make in the aftermath, to forgive, to rebuild, to welcome. Beneath the birches, the plaque still waits for visitors. Its words are simple, "Neighbors made here." And every time someone reads it, whether in English or in German, they are reminded that redemption is possible, even in a place once called a prison.